They say still waters run deep, but some waters are never truly still. Some carry the weight of tragedy and secrets too heavy to stay buried, and legends that refuse to die. Tonight, we're traveling to two lakes on opposite ends of the country. In Georgia, there's a lake that was never meant to exist. Built over lost towns and forgotten graves, its waters shimmer in the sunlight, but underneath, there's darkness, pure darkness. People say they feel it before they even see it. The weight, the pressure, the chill that settles too deep in your chest, the memory of all the lives it has claimed, earning its reputation as one of the most haunted lakes in America. Locals whisper that the dead never left, that the people whose homes and bodies were taken still stir in the murky depths. And that's why the lake keeps taking, year after year, one life after another, as if it's calling in a debt that can never be repaid. 2,000 miles away in the mountains of Oregon, another lake waits, born from fire, destruction, and the collapse of a world. Crater Lake's waters are impossibly still, impossibly blue, and surrounded by ancient legends of gods and underworld spirits. Today it is known for its mysterious lights, vanishings, and depths no human has ever touched. Lake Lanier and Crater Lake, two very different bodies of water, yet both share a reputation for the eerie and the unexplainable. Both are beautiful, both are deadly, and both have become something more than water. They are mirrors of the human soul, reflecting what has been lost, what has been buried, and what refuses to stay submerged. Some say the lakes are cursed, alive with something teeming and hungry, just under the surface. If you stand at the edge of these lakes, you'll feel it, that vibration, that hum, that sense that something ancient is awake beneath you. Both lakes are mirrors, one forged by human hands, the other by nature's fury. Both hold the same uneasy silence, the same call of the void and subtle pull, like they're waiting for you to get just a little too close. Hello everybody, happy Harloween and welcome back to my channel. I picked this topic for Harloween because, as you know, I'm very interested in history and how it shapes the future. I wanted to talk about these two lakes because they're more than just eerie bodies of water. They're reflections of everything time leaves behind. Just like time shapes the geology and geography of our world, history shapes the energy of the places we inhabit. Every tragedy, every act of violence, every loss leaves an imprint, just as wind and water carve into stone, just like the crashing waves form the shoreline and turn ancient fossils into tiny grains of sand. Nothing is ever truly gone. It's only changed, ground down, and folded back into the story of the earth itself. Lake Lanier and Crater Lake remind us that creation and ruin often share the same space, and sometimes what looks peaceful on the surface is still shifting, still alive, still haunted by everything that came before. We have so much to learn about and talk about today. Before we dive into today's video, let's have a word from the sponsor of the video, Surfshark VPN. Let's be honest, it's 2025. Everyone's on the internet at this point, right? From kids to older generations, everyone is on the internet to some extent. And if you spend as much time on the internet as I do, researching stories, streaming shows, or even just booking travel, you know it's not exactly always the most friendly place. Between hackers, data tracking, and websites that seem to know more about you than your best friend does, it's smart to have some protection in place, and that's where Surfshark VPN comes in. Now, one of my favorite things about Surfshark is that it doesn't just keep you safe, it also opens up the entire world of online entertainment. You can unlock 15 of the largest Netflix libraries, access shows from BBC iPlayer, Hulu, and so many others that aren't normally available where you live. It's honestly perfect for when you want to unwind with something new, whether that's a crime documentary from the UK, they've got great crime shows and documentaries, or a creepy foreign horror film to keep the Harloween vibes alive just a little longer, which we are absolutely doing as we're continuing Halloween into November. And if you're traveling, maybe heading somewhere sunny to escape the cold, Surfshark makes it easy to stay connected and secure. You can use public Wi-Fi without worrying about who's watching. You can access your bank safely from abroad and even get better prices on flights and rentals by switching server locations. Because maybe you knew this or maybe you didn't, but there's price discrimination going on with things like flights and rental cars and stuff like that. So you can kind of play around with it and see if you can get better deals by changing your location. A little fun fact, a little tip, a little travel hack to save some money this season. Surfshark is the kind of tool that quietly does a lot for you behind the scenes, and once you have it, you'll wonder how you ever went online without it. I've been using it for years at this point. I mean, honestly, probably over 4 years, and I will not go on the internet without it. For me, the biggest thing is privacy. Surfshark encrypts everything, your passwords, messages, photos, so your personal information stays just that, personal. They also have a strict no logs policy, meaning they don't track or store what you do online, and their clean web feature blocks ads, malware, and phishing attempts before they ever reach you. It's peace of mind, especially if you have your kids or family online as well. And that's where the next great feature of Surfshark comes in, because you can run Surfshark VPN on an unlimited number of devices. Your phone, laptop, tablet, smart TV, even your gaming consoles. And that means your kids' gaming consoles, your kids' tablets, because you know they're on all sorts of stuff, Roblox, what the heck ever. They're playing these games on their PlayStations and they're talking to people, and who knows who those people are. And we want to be good parents and we want to keep an eye on them and keep them safe, but we cannot watch them 24/7. And even, hey, you're worried about your older parents getting hacked by some email scam, you can have them put Surfshark on their phones and their computers as well. So yeah, the whole household can stay protected with just one subscription. It is so worth it. It is more than worth it. And if you want to give it a try, which you definitely should, Surfshark is offering an amazing deal right now. All you have to do is go to surfshark.com/stephanieharlowe, use code stephanieharlowe at checkout, and you're going to get 4 extra months of Surfshark VPN for free. Once again, that's surfshark.com/stephanieharlowe. Use code stephanieharlowe to get 4 extra months of Surfshark for free. Also, there's a 30-day money-back guarantee, so you can try it out, see if you like it, which you will. You have absolutely nothing to lose. It's completely risk-free, and I will also shout out Surfshark's amazing 24/7 customer service. I'm not technologically minded, and there have been times I've run into issues or had questions, and they are right there. They're friendly, they're quick, you're not waiting on hold forever. It's just an amazing team over there at Surfshark. So thank you so much to Surfshark for sponsoring today's video, and let's dive in. Lake Lanier sits in northern Georgia, about an hour northeast of Atlanta, where the foothills of the Blue Ridge Mountains start to roll and fold like an old quilt, stitched with forests and fog. Spread out across nearly 60 square miles, Lake Lanier gleams like a sheet of glass. And when you look at Lake Lanier today with its boats and beaches and summer crowds, it's easy to forget that beneath the waves lies a ghost of the past. This is no ordinary lake. In the early 1950s, the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers began construction of a dam, Buford Dam, along the Chattahoochee River. The project promised progress, but as it often does, progress came at a cost. To create what would become Lake Lanier, more than 38,000 acres of farmland, forest, churches, businesses, and homes were claimed by the government, and whole communities were erased from the map. The Corps made an effort to move some buildings, some cemeteries, but not all. Records were incomplete, coffins were missed, graves were left behind. And when the waters rose, they swallowed everything: headstones, bodies, and history itself. On a clear day, the surface of the lake sparkles, calm and inviting. Boats drift lazily across it, children laugh along its beaches, and families picnic beneath the shades of oak and maple. But anyone who's lived here long enough knows that Lanier's beauty is deceptive. Over 10 million people visit the lake annually, despite the fact that since its creation in the mid-1950s, Lake Lanier has seen over 700 deaths. That includes drownings, electrocutions, boating accidents, countless other tragedies, and quite a few missing people. From 1994 through 2022, the lake claimed approximately 216 lives. In 2023, there were at least 13 additional deaths. In 2024, a man died swimming back to a boat. And just this year, there have been even more drownings. That means that Lake Lanier averages about 10 fatalities a year, which is nearly 30 times higher than the national average for lakes in the lower 48 states. So basically, when people say Lake Lanier is haunted, it's cursed, it's trying to call in a debt that it can just never be repaid. This is why. The death toll in this lake is just far higher than the average for other lakes in the United States, far higher. And because of this, many locals feel the lake is cursed, with many expressing the fact that even though they live nearby, they don't go near that water. One Reddit user said, quote, "I don't go in it. I don't go up there at all. One of my friends died there in high school. I was gonna start open water swimming there with a group, but then one morning they found a dead body and I just, no thanks," end quote. Another said, quote, "I live about an hour away from it, and one 4th of July, I had bad anxiety, like shaking, throwing up, and that same day a person drowned. I was in the water when they did. That lake has such bad vibes around it," end quote. Another local expressed vehemently, quote, "Nobody I know goes to Lake Lanier. Stay out of that lake," end quote.
Behind me is a lake that some say is the most beautiful in Georgia. It's man-made, but it has a tragic history and a tragic current legacy as well.
Yo, this is the most deadly lake in the entire U.S., Lake Lanier. It's crazy. Y'all see how empty this bitch is? It's like people know everybody come in here die. I mean, they try to save you, but I don't know. I heard that ain't even enough for this shit.
Margaritaville at Lanier Islands is a resort complex on the shores of Lake Lanier, and in 2024, the resort launched a major expansion called the Fins Up Water Park, the centerpiece of which would be Apocalypso, Georgia's first waterslide coaster. Headlines initially made it sound like thrill seekers would be sliding on the coaster straight into the depths of the lake that's claimed hundreds of lives, and locals reacted in kind, with one critic asking, quote, "Are they trying to up the body count of Lake Lanier?" End quote. And another local resident stating, quote, "You have to be living under a rock to ever visit this," end quote. The people who live around Lake Lanier know better than most what lies beneath its surface. They've grown up hearing the legends, being exposed to the local media coverage that the rest of the country doesn't get to see. Another drowning, another missing boater, another tragedy that seems to play out the same way year after year. They know the dark history that has shaped the lake over the course of centuries, and after this video, you will know it too. By the time the first humans arrived in North Georgia, the land had already lived a dozen lifetimes. The rocks around Lake Lanier are among the oldest in North America, dating back to over 1 billion years in some places. Beneath the modern lake, the soil carries the crushed dust of mountains that once touched the sky. Around 335 million years ago, all of Earth's continents were fused together in a single supercontinent called Pangaea, and the region that is now Georgia was located much farther south, roughly at the equator, and was part of the eastern edge of the North American plate, pressed up against what would one day become Africa. At that time, the area that now forms the Appalachian Mountains and the rolling foothills where Lake Lanier sits, was part of a vast mountain chain created when those continents collided. Picture a Himalayan scale range stretching from modern Alabama all the way to Newfoundland. And as Pangaea began to rip apart around 175 to 200 million years ago, the land that would become North America started drifting northwest, pulling away from Africa. Now, the tearing of the supercontinent created fault lines, fractures, and basins, and filled the region with mineral-rich soils and underground aquifers. Rivers like the Chattahoochee, which now feeds Lake Lanier, trace their origins to these ancient tectonic movements, and over millions of years, erosion wore those towering Pangaean mountains down to the gentle, undulating hills we see today, which are the Appalachian foothills, old as time itself, older even than the Atlantic Ocean. The Blue Ridge Mountains, which form the Lanier Basin, are the eroded remnants of the once towering ancient mountain range. Now, we're going to go a bit far back into time, but bear with me and trust that I will never bring you on a side quest that does not tie back to the topic at hand. Long before there was a lake here, people had already called this land home for thousands of years. Archaeologists have found spear points scattered across northern Georgia, Clovis and Dalton points, the calling cards of the first people who arrived after the last ice age around 10,000 BCE. Back then, the world looked very different. Huge bison and woolly mammoths roamed the valleys, and the people followed them, moving with the seasons, hunting, gathering, surviving. But as the ice melted and the climate warmed, those early families began to settle down. They built small camps along rivers and streams, including the area that would one day become Lake Lanier, and they kept coming back to the same places year after year. Over generations, those temporary camps became permanent villages. They learned to plant crops, raise families, and trade with their neighbors. And before long, this region was dotted with towns, each one centered around tall earthen mounds with temples or chiefs' houses on top, surrounded by wooden walls and open plazas where the community gathered. They weren't primitive wanderers anymore. They were builders, artists, and traders, crafting copper jewelry and ceremonial pottery that still survives today. By the 1500s, the people who lived in this region had become what we now know as the Cherokee, one of the most powerful nations in the Southeast. They didn't just appear out of nowhere, they were the direct descendants of the older cultures that had lived here for thousands of years. The Cherokee built permanent villages across northern Georgia, eastern Tennessee, and western North Carolina. And these were very advanced communities. They were communities connected by roads, trade routes, and alliances that stretched for miles. When Spanish explorer Hernando de Soto arrived in 1540, he expected to find wilderness. Instead, he walked into a thriving world that was ancient, yes, but organized and very much alive. He described towns filled with food and art, leaders draped in cloaks of feathers and pearls, and people who practiced diplomacy and strategy. When he demanded supplies or captives, some chiefs did negotiate, offering gifts or guides to send him and his men on their way. Others, they refused. They burned their own towns rather than let them fall into Spanish hands. But De Soto brought something far worse than fire or swords, or ignorance. His army carried invisible weapons, smallpox, influenza, measles, and in the decades that followed, those diseases tore through the Southeast, wiping out nearly 90% of the indigenous population. The world De Soto had marveled at, the one so full of life and power, it fell quiet within a century. The Cherokee who survived those first waves of disease and conquest, they rebuilt. They stayed in the Appalachian foothills, the same lands De Soto's men once trudged through, and from the ashes of that devastation, they formed what became the Cherokee Nation. They built towns, farms, and trading posts, and by the 1700s, they were one of the most powerful and sophisticated nations in North America, literate, agricultural, and deeply connected to their history and their homeland. Their capital, New Echota, sat just 60 miles north of where Lake Lanier would one day be. From the 1600s into the early 1800s, the Cherokee flourished. They adopted a written language, they established schools, and even created their own constitution and newspaper. And they got a lot of this knowledge and a lot of this advancement from the white man who had come in and started sort of habitating in the region. The explorers, the settlers, the colonists. They got a lot of farming information from them, even, how to run a printing press, things like this. And for a while, the natives and the white man managed to coexist, right? They learned things from each other. They got help from each other. But after the American Revolutionary War, that all changed. The new U.S. government began opening frontier lands to white settlers, offering soldiers payment for their service in the form of land. But this was land that already belonged to someone. It belonged to the Cherokee and had for generations. By the 1780s, settlers from Virginia and the Carolinas began pouring into northern Georgia, drawn by rich farmland and opportunity. The Cherokee signed treaty after treaty in an effort to survive, but each treaty carved away more of their territory. Then came 1828, the discovery of gold in Dahlonega, less than 20 miles from where Lake Lanier sits today. It was America's first gold rush, and it destroyed whatever piece was left. Thousands of prospectors flooded into Cherokee country, mining, digging, claiming land that wasn't theirs to claim. And the state of Georgia didn't stop them. Instead, it made the theft official. Lawmakers dissolved the Cherokee Nation's political rights, annexed their land into Georgia counties, and passed laws so that the Cherokee people couldn't even testify in court against white citizens. Because if somebody comes and takes your land, you'd usually be able to go to court and say, hey, I've been living here for 60 years, and before that, my father lived here for 80 years, and before that, his father lived here for, 75 years. So this is clearly my land. But then they made laws where no Indigenous person could testify against a white person in court. So they didn't even have that opportunity to go to court and settle it. In one move, the government erased centuries of sovereignty. The Cherokee took their fight to the Supreme Court, and they won. They actually won. Chief Justice John Marshall ruled that the Cherokee Nation was a distinct sovereign entity and that Georgia had no right to their land. But then President Andrew Jackson had no intention of honoring that decision, and he reportedly sneered, quote, "John Marshall has made his decision, now let him enforce it," end quote, meaning I'm not going to help him. As part of the federal government, I'm not going to help him protect these people that he ruled deserve protection. I have the army. I have, all of these people at my whim who could help, but I'm not going to do that. So let John Marshall over there in the Supreme Court figure it out himself. In 1835, the U.S. government finally found a way to make removal of Indigenous peoples legal. They pressured a small group of Cherokee leaders into signing what became known as the Treaty of New Echata, an agreement that handed over every acre of Cherokee land east of the Mississippi in exchange for land in Oklahoma and $5 million. But here's the thing. This was just a small group of some Cherokee leaders. Most Cherokee people themselves never agreed to it and didn't want it, and their principal chief, John Ross, fought against it. But the ink dried anyway, and once it did, the government treated the treaty as binding. It all really traced back to the Indian Removal Act of 1830, a law that gave President Andrew Jackson the authority to negotiate with Native nations for their land, though negotiation wasn't really the right word. It was pressure, threats, manipulation. And some of the Cherokee did leave, feeling their removal was inevitable, but many refused to vacate the lands of their ancestors voluntarily. And when the Cherokee refused to leave willingly, the army was called in to finish the job. Jackson's successor, President Martin Van Buren, ordered soldiers to round up more than 16,000 Cherokee men, women, and children. At first, these people were kept in makeshift camps with very little food or shelter, and then over the fall and winter of 1838 into 1839, the Cherokee were forced to march roughly 1,000 miles to Oklahoma. It is estimated that roughly 5,000 Cherokee died along the way from disease, starvation, exhaustion, and exposure. And the survivors called this harrowing and tragic journey the Trail Where They Cried, otherwise known as the Trail of Tears. When the Cherokee were driven from these hills, something more than homes and fields were taken from them. The removal was brutal. Families ripped from their land, their ancestors' graves left behind, their songs cut short. But the energy of a place doesn't just reset when the people are gone. The violence of that act, the grief, the betrayal, the fear, the powerlessness, it all sank into the ground like rainwater. It seeped into the red clay, into the roots of the pines, and into the river that would one day be dammed to form Lake Lanier. There's a little bit of a double entendre there. It would be dammed, the river would be dammed, but that river would also be damned, if you know what I mean. Every storm that passed, every drop of water that ran through this soil carried a trace of that sorrow and the tears of the people who had called that land home for thousands of years. The land remembered, and the water remembered. And when the government returned more than a century later to flood this valley, to bury what was left of the Cherokee's homeland beneath thousands of acres of water, it wasn't just a construction project, it was a second burial. And some say that that kind of pain leaves behind an echo, an ancient debt that the earth itself tries to balance. Maybe that's why this place has never found peace. And you'd think that would be enough to disrupt the peace and balance of nature in this area. But there would be more, because while this was the first act of expulsion that this land and the surrounding hills would witness, it would not be the last. The Cherokee had found peace and prosperity in this area for a very long time. They had created bloodlines, lived, loved, worked, and worshipped. They had built something from nothing only for it to be snatched from them in the name of greed and ignorance. And once they were gone, that valley thrived again for a time. New generations were born, worked the fields, built small communities, and raised their children under the same Georgia sun that had once warmed the Cherokee. But history, it seems, has a way of circling back on itself, finding new names, new faces, new victims. Decades after the Cherokee were forced out, another community would rise in these hills, a town called Oscarville. When the Civil War ended in 1865, the formerly enslaved people of Georgia were suddenly and very precariously free. When the Emancipation Proclamation was read, it was supposed to mean freedom, but what does freedom actually mean when you have nothing? No land, no money, no education, no protection. When you've been told your whole life that you are property, and then one day the world just opens the door and says, you're free to go, without offering a place to go to. The truth is, for most formerly enslaved people, freedom was little more than a word. They walked away from the plantations with the clothes on their backs and a lifetime of unpaid labor behind them. The government promised 40 acres and a mule, a fresh start, but that promise dissolved as quickly as it was spoken. The land went back to the same men who had once owned their bodies, and the freedmen were left to rent it from those men all over again. So, a lot of them stayed close to the places they knew, clinging to patches of earth that had already soaked up their sweat and their blood. They built homes from splintered timber, churches from salvaged boards, and schools from nothing but faith and willpower. And out of that fragile hope, towns like Oscarville were born. Oscarville was a small but thriving farming community in Forsyth County, Georgia, about 50 miles northeast of Atlanta, and it was founded in the late 1800s during the Reconstruction era. Many of its residents were sharecroppers or small landowners, growing corn, cotton, and vegetables, scraping together a living through hard work and cooperation. By the early 1900s, it was home to hundreds of Black families who farmed the land, built those churches and those schools, and forged lives for themselves in the shadow of the Jim Crow South. But in 1912, everything changed. The relative success and independence of Black farmers in Forsyth County created racial tension among some white residents who resented their progress and their presence. As Jim Crow laws tightened across the South, white supremacy surged, fueled by the Ku Klux Klan and other local vigilante groups whose goal it was to keep the county racially pure. All it took was one spark to ignite the violence that would erase Oscarville from the map, and that spark happened in September of 1912. May Crow was an 18-year-old white woman living in the rural community of Big Creek in Forsyth County. She came from a working-class farming family who were not necessarily wealthy, but they were locally respected. Her father, Gordon Crow, was a farmer, and her mother, Nancy, kept the home and cared for several children. On September 8, 1912, May left home to visit her aunt, but she never made it to her intended destination, and she never came home again. At the same time, tensions were rising over another incident that had taken place just days before. On September 5th, a 22-year-old white woman from Forsyth County named Ellen Grice had claimed a black man had broken into her home at night while her husband was away. An angry search party arrested 5 black men from Oscarville, accusing them of being a part of this incident. 2 days later, word had spread that these men had been arrested, and a white mob formed around the jail they were being held in. Reverend Grant Smith, a black preacher who questioned Ellen Grice's story, he was beaten by the crowd. And officials did intervene, so the Reverend was temporarily protected in the courthouse, but things were still brewing outside because meanwhile, a large gathering of Oscarville residents who had been attending a nearby barbecue tried to approach the jail because they heard what was going on there, and rumors inflated the already angry white mob into mass fear because it had been going around that the Oscarville residents, who were black, were coming armed to bomb the town of Cummings, where the jail was, and so the Georgia National Guard had to be called in to quell the growing tension. On September 8th, when it was revealed that May Crow was missing, search parties were sent out to find her, and they did find her the following day. She was unconscious, in very bad shape in the woods near her home. She had been beaten, her throat had been slashed, and nearby, where her body was found, searchers found a small pocket mirror. May was rushed to a doctor, alive but barely hanging on. Rumors then circulated that one of Oscarville's young men, 17-year-old Ernest Knox, might have been involved with the attack on May. Now, Knox was new to the area. He was staying with the Daniel family, and after being questioned, he admitted to owning the mirror that was found near May's body, and he was promptly arrested by Sheriff Bill Reed. Following Knox's arrest, 24-year-old Rob Edwards was also arrested as an alleged accomplice, and Rob Edwards was tied by marriage to the Daniel family. Soon after, a large white mob descended on the Cummings jail. They broke in, they dragged Edwards out, and publicly lynched him from a telephone pole. His body was shot multiple times and then left, displayed for all to see. In the days that followed, more black residents from Oscarville were arrested in connection with the May Crow assault. Those 3 men were Jane Daniel, his 17-year-old brother Oscar Daniel, and Ed Collins, the Daniel family's 27-year-old neighbor. As all of this was happening, white vigilantes began widespread violence and intimidation. They burned black churches, raided homes, and posted notices ordering black residents to leave Forsyth County immediately. And then, on September 23, 1912, May Crow succumbed to her injuries. But because she had never regained consciousness, she'd never been able to tell anyone what exactly had happened to her or who had been responsible. She was later buried at Pleasant Grove Church near her family home, and the charges against Knox and the others were upgraded to include murder, in addition to assault. So after Edwards had basically been abducted from the Cumming jail and lynched in front of everybody as a full spectacle, the jailers and the government in general, they decided to move the other 4 prisoners from Cumming to the Fulton County Jail in Atlanta for their protection. But then on October 2nd, soldiers brought the accused men back from Fulton County Jail to Cumming, and the town was waiting. In separate trials before all-white juries, Ernest Knox and Oscar Daniel were found guilty of assault and murder. The verdicts came fast. Too fast, and mainly because Ed Collins and Jane Daniel acted as witnesses and told the story that the mob wanted to hear, that Knox, Daniel, and Rob Edwards had attacked May Crow while Jane held a lantern borrowed from Collins, lighting the scene. The judge sentenced both Ernest Knox and Oscar Daniel to die by hanging, and he ordered the executions to take place privately behind a tall wooden fence. But the night before the hangings, local white residents tore the fence down and set it on fire. And then the next morning, October 25th, thousands of people gathered in an open field owned by Dr. Ansel Strickland to watch the executions. It was once again a public spectacle. In the days that followed, the violence spread. White vigilantes calling themselves night riders swept through Oscarville and the surrounding communities. They moved under the cover of darkness, wearing hoods or masks, riding horses and in wagons, claiming they were enforcing order. Many were local men, neighbors, shopkeepers, farmers, some with direct ties to the Ku Klux Klan, which was growing in strength again across the South. They went door to door with guns, threatening black families, burning homes, torching churches. By the end, more than 1,000 black men, women, and children were driven out of Forsyth County. Now, I like to be historically accurate about things, no matter how horrendous they are. And I think the story of Oscarville and what happened to it and to the people there is just absolutely gruesome and horrific enough without having to exaggerate or add to it. However, on some websites, in certain news reports, you will hear a story that once the people of Oscarville were driven out, they were chased all the way to the river. And then without knowing what to do and with kind of having their backs to the wall or the river, many of them jumped into the river and then drowned. From what I could tell, and I searched high and low and went through a lot of sources, there's no historical accuracy to that story. It seems to be a story that kind of passed down from a few Oscarville residents. They told their kids told their kids, and then we have, something that became a little bit of a legend, but there doesn't seem to be any actual facts to back that up. And it really wouldn't make sense anyways, because there was a bridge over the river at that time, so they could have just crossed the bridge. They wouldn't have had to have jumped into the river. So once again, I like to be historically accurate. I like to let history speak for itself with all its atrocities. We don't need to exaggerate and add to it. What happened to the people of Oscarville was terrible. Their land was taken. Their livelihoods were destroyed. And once the people and the families were gone, the night riders stayed behind to plunder. They looted homes, stole livestock, and harvested crops left in the fields. Some of the land was later sold to white neighbors for pennies. Much of it was simply taken. Oscarville, once a thriving black community, became a ghost town. Decades later, descendants of Oscarville families would still possess receipts, deeds, and letters showing legal ownership of land they were never compensated for. For decades, Forsyth County remained almost entirely white, and this was by intention, by force. And the county became so notorious for its racial exclusion that by the 1970s and 1980s, civil rights activists referred to it as one of the most closed counties in America. For instance, a place where a black person driving through might not want to drive through after dark, or really any time. And even into the 1980s, white residents still proudly talked about how they had made Forsyth County all white. They still remembered the purge of Oscarville, not with shame, but as the time the county was cleaned out. And it wasn't until the 1987 Civil Rights March, led by Hosea Williams, that Forsyth's violent and unapologetic past was thrust into the national spotlight with the help of Oprah Winfrey. And I wish I could play you this video, because there's a video of Oprah talking to people who lived in Forsyth County. I know there's going to be copyright issues because Oprah does not mess around with her money, and that's why she's Oprah, but I'll link it in the description box so you can watch it if you feel like it. In the video, though, Oprah asks a woman who is a Forsyth County resident, quote, "You don't believe that people of other races have the right to live here?" End quote. And the woman responds, quote, "They have the right to live wherever they want to, but we have the right to choose if we want a white community also. That's why we moved here." End quote. So Forsyth County has attempted to make up for its past crimes, and in 2022, a scholarship was established for descendants of the expelled black families, giving each recipient up to $10,000 a year for undergraduate studies for up to 4 years. which I mean, it's like a start. It's a start, but it's a pretty minimal start. Good starting point. Let's see what else you can do. Now, after World War II, the United States was expanding rapidly, building suburbs, highways, and infrastructure to power a burgeoning modern America. In the South, the federal government turned its eyes to the Chattahoochee River, one of the region's most vital waterways. By the mid-20th century, the Chattahoochee had become the economic artery of Georgia, supplying water and power for growing cities like Atlanta, Columbus, and West Point. And the Chattahoochee has always been a lifeline, right? For the Cherokee, it was sacred, a river of sustenance and song. For early settlers, it was the road that carved Georgia into being. And by the 1950s, the government saw it as something else entirely, a resource to be harnessed, controlled, contained. Now, they said that building a dam was vital for the surrounding area, for flood control, for power, for progress. The Army Corps of Engineers sold the idea of Beaufort Dam and Lake Lanier as a safeguard, a way to control seasonal flooding, but the truth was, the post-war South was industrializing and demand for electricity was absolutely soaring. Beaufort Dam was designed to generate hydroelectric power for the Tennessee Valley Authority grid and for the city of Atlanta. Engineers estimated that the turbines could generate 250 million kilowatt hours per year, which would be enough to power hundreds of thousands of homes. The plan was to build the dam on the Chattahoochee River to hold back and redirect the river's natural flow, intentionally flooding the surrounding valley to create a man-made reservoir, which would become Lake Lanier. Tens of thousands of acres of land would be needed to accomplish this, and so the Corps chose a valley in northeast Georgia, stretching across Hall, Forsyth, Dawson, Gwinnett, and Lumpkin counties, the same region that had once been Cherokee territory and later the site of Oscarville. The location was ideal from an engineering standpoint due to the abundant rain that fell there and its very close proximity to Atlanta. But once again, this land wasn't empty and free for the taking. By the early 1950s, it was home to over 700 families, dozens of churches, schools, and cemeteries, including the remnants of Oscarville and other rural farming communities. Construction of Beaufort Dam began in 1950, and with it came another round of forced relocations. The government started buying up property, offering families compensation for their homes and land, but those offers were nowhere near fair market value. Anyone who refused to sell was hit with something called eminent domain, which basically means the government can take your land for a public project as long as they promise to pay what they call fair compensation. So many air quotes in that sentence, my fingers hurt. Because here's the catch. They were the ones who decided what fair meant, right? Appraisers would come out, walk the property, walk the land, take their notes, and assign a number that rarely reflected what was really being taken. And for poor rural families living in the Chattahoochee Valley, fighting that number in court was virtually impossible. They couldn't afford lawyers, and they knew what would happen to them if they said no. It wasn't negotiation, it was coercion. Sign the papers or be dragged out when the bulldozers came. When the dam gates finally closed and the water began to rise, people stood on the hills and watched their farms, homes, and churches vanish beneath the surface. Once again, they didn't just lose their land, they lost the proof that they had ever belonged to it. For this region, it was history repeating itself. Another generation forced out, another community erased. First, the Cherokee, then Oscarville, then these poor rural families who didn't have enough money to fight the government in court. A total of 6 churches and 15 businesses were deconstructed and then reconstructed elsewhere, but the majority of these were wooden structures, so it was easier to do that. The buildings and homes that were made of concrete or brick could not be moved, and the only choice was to leave them abandoned. 20 cemeteries had their remains disinterred, moving more than 700 graves to higher ground, but this is where things get murky, because not all graves were able to be located and then relocated. The valley was home to hundreds of small family burial plots, the kind that dotted old farms and churchyards from the 1800s and early 1900s. Many were unmarked or had wooden crosses that had long since rotted away. Others were simply unknown to authorities, forgotten, or lost to overgrowth. The Corps admitted later that it was impossible to find and move every grave, and in those cases where the graves were not located and moved, when the waters rose, they were simply left behind. That means there are almost certainly hundreds of graves still under the water, unmarked and unrested. Imagine entire churchyards and family plots, bones, caskets, and headstones swallowed up. Lanier isn't just a lake, it's a submerged graveyard. When the valley filled, the water swallowed everything in its path. Trees still stood rooted in the soil, barns and chimneys jutted up from the depths. Few of them were ever cleared away. What sank stayed where it was, waiting beneath the surface, unseen until someone struck it. Also, keep in mind, Lake Lanier is large in every form of the word. Its surface area is about 38,000 acres. Its shoreline is roughly 692 miles, longer than the entire coastline of California if it were stretched out end to end. It holds roughly 625 billion gallons of water, and the average depth of the lake is around 60 feet, but near the dam, where the valley floor drops the deepest, it can be as deep as 200 feet. The lake is about twice the size of Manhattan and deeper than most skyscrapers are tall. And to understand scale, if Lake Lanier were drained, it could completely flood the entire city of Atlanta under 5 feet of water. Beneath the lake lies the skeletal outline of an entire valley, and divers report finding all sorts of things down there. Fully intact streets, stone walls, house foundations. There are sunken boats and wreckage and an enormous amount of hazards and all sorts of things that a person could get snagged on.
Clear and calm on the surface, Lake Lanier is anything but.
You can get yourself in trouble really quickly.
Lanier was built in the 1950s to provide drinking water and hydroelectric power for Atlanta. Recreation was an afterthought.
As they were building the lake, they raised the water level up to a certain point well below what we know of today as full pool, and then stopped filling the water.
From there, construction crews floated on the lake, cutting off the trees about halfway.
So today, those stumps are still there, and they're tall, because this was forest land and farmland.
Also beneath the surface, old homes, barns, even a racetrack, which famously surfaced during the 2007 drought. You could see the tops of the stands, a haunted memory, waiting for spectators to show up for the next race. It's all good now, but when the next drought comes...
When that does, everyone needs to use extreme caution on the lake.
The Forsyth or Hall County dive teams respond to every rescue and recovery call.
Generally, within the first hour, we're in what we call rescue mode. We're hoping that we can rescue someone.
No, I don't want to lose a diver.
Divers deal with frigid temperatures, near zero visibility, and all of those underwater hazards.
The bridges are like the trash bin for anyone traveling down the roads. They blew the old bridges in place, so you have concrete, rebar.
The divers work in teams, one person in the water and the other on the shore. They're tethered together by a rope and communicate by tugs on the rope. Divers say they never know what they're going to find.
It's bad enough that you got a loss of life, but you see their grieving family. And that's really why we do this. I couldn't imagine as a father, as a brother, as a son, to see one of my loved ones disappear and have to go by this lake every day and just wonder. That I wouldn't wish that on anyone.
And this is where the darkness creeps in. Locals say that on a still night, when the lake is quiet, you can hear muffled cries, whispers, or the faint sounds of splashing, as though someone unseen is struggling beneath the surface. Experienced divers who have explored the lake's depths tell unsettling stories, such as encountering sudden cold spots in otherwise warm water, and unnatural chills that feel like someone is moving past them in the murky, dark depths. Boaters have even sworn that they've heard voices calling their names, only to find no one nearby. Some say the violence that destroyed Oscarville never really left, that the hatred, the terror, the blood spilled in 1912 seeped into the earth, and when the floodwaters came, the lake itself absorbed it. And perhaps that's another reason why Lake Lanier has never been just another reservoir. From the very beginning, it has carried a reputation for darkness, its waters demanding sacrifice, its depths echoing with unrest. A lake born from tragedy and sustained by it, it seems. Since the first floodgates closed in the 1950s, Lake Lanier has claimed hundreds of lives, too many to dismiss as coincidence. Some drownings make sense, I guess. Sudden storms, overturned boats, the cold shock of deep water. But others don't. Take, for instance, the case of 43-year-old Dustin Valencia, a father of 5, who went missing while kayaking on Lake Lanier on or around May 14th of 2025. His car was found parked at Little Ridge Park, but his inflatable kayak was not located, and his body was found submerged 51 feet deep several days later. Another case is that of 27-year-old Raymond Diaz Soria, who was on the lake in a boat for a birthday celebration on June 14th, 2025. He jumped off the boat wearing a life jacket, and then his body was later found in 60 feet of water. The life jacket was found later floating. Nobody knows. Why would he take it off? How did it get off? How did he jump off a boat while all these people were on the boat and could see him, and then suddenly he drowned? It just doesn't make sense. There's also a case of another person, a 24-year-old man who jumped off a dock into Lake Lanier, and he was electrocuted. He died because of electrocution, which is very strange and odd and not a normal thing that you hear. There are stories of swimmers pulled down by invisible hands, divers who said they felt something brush against them in the dark, or rescuers who swore they heard voices echoing through their headsets. Locals say it's the lake itself, that it remembers what was taken, what was buried, and that it doesn't rest easy. They say the water is cursed, and out of all the stories that ripple through these depths, one has endured the longest, and for a good reason, and that's the story of the Lady of the Lake and the tragic tale of Susie Roberts and Delia Parker Young. Before they became part of the legend of Lake Lanier, Susie Roberts and Delia Parker Young were just 2 women from Gainesville, Georgia, friends, mothers, and neighbors who had known each other their whole lives. Susie was 38, a mother of 4, newly divorced but still devoted to her family. The story goes that even after separating from her husband, she went to his home twice a week to clean, cook, and spend time with their children. She worked as a waitress at the Uptown bus station, and she was trying to get her life back on track. Delia was younger, just 23, but she and Susie had grown up side by side on Springway Drive in Gainesville. Their families were close, their siblings inseparable. The girls played together as children, ate at each other's kitchen tables, and despite the years between them, grew into a friendship that felt more like sisterhood. Delia had recently married a man named William Early Young, and she worked at Riverside Military Academy in Gainesville. She was quiet, kind, and known for her easy smile and demeanor, a young woman just beginning to build her life. On an April night in 1958, the 2 of them decided to go out together to the Three Gables Dance Hall in Dawsonville, about 20 miles from home. Susie drove them there in her 1952 Ford sedan. Delia rode shotgun, and they spent the evening dancing, laughing, and escaping, just for a few hours, from the heavy responsibilities waiting for them both back home. When the night ended, they said their goodbyes, got into Susie's Ford, and headed back toward Gainesville, crossing the bridge over the newly made lake that shimmered dark beneath the moonlight. It was supposed to be an ordinary drive home after a fun night shared between 2 lifelong friends, but somewhere between Dawsonville and Gainesville, the road disappeared, and so did they. By the next morning, their families were worried. There had been no sign of Susie or Delia, and the car they were driving hadn't been found, abandoned or left anywhere. However, searchers located skid marks on Dawsonville Highway, which is now known as State Route 53. The marks were heading toward the bridge that crossed the northern end of Lake Lanier, and they indicated that a northbound vehicle had crossed over the center line of the road and gone into the lake about 50 feet before reaching the bridge. Diving operations began at the lake with 5 divers under the direction of Henry Ward, the Hall County coroner. The divers focused on the left side of the bridge, where the skid marks had indicated the car might have gone into the water. They searched for Susie's Ford in the lake's murky depths for days, but they found nothing. On the banks of Lake Lanier, though, police did discover a piece of chrome and a battered sun visor that authorities stated could have possibly come from a Ford automobile, but without the actual vehicle or the bodies of the missing women, no one could say for sure what had happened. There were a lot of theories, of course. People were saying that the women had been involved in organized crime before their disappearances and the mafia had come and taken them away. People were saying that both women were tired of their husbands and their children, and they wanted to just leave, go somewhere, start fresh, start new lives. There were apparently sightings of Susie and Delia in Florida and other places, but for over a year, the mystery of what had happened to Susie Roberts and Delia Parker Young deepened, along with the grief and confusion of their loved ones. Despite the alleged sightings of Susie and Delia in other states and the, allegations and rumors that they'd been involved in something unsavory, their families insisted that neither woman would have voluntarily left their children, and they didn't have any connections to organized crime or any kind of crime. However, after their disappearances, locals began to report strange happenings around the Dawsonville Highway Bridge. So truckers, fishermen, and late-night motorists described seeing a woman standing or walking along the highway near the bridge. She was always wearing a blue dress. She always appeared to be confused or lost. And the most chilling detail in these sightings was that the woman was missing both of her hands. Even before anybody knew what had happened to Susie or Delia, there were whispers of a spirit haunting the Dawsonville Highway and Bridge, and that spirit got the name of Lady of the Lake. Now, 18 months after Susie and Delia vanished, a decomposing body was discovered by a fisherman in Lake Lanier. The body was floating on the lake's surface beneath the bridge, and not only was it missing 2 toes from its left foot, but it had no hands. The autopsy performed by Dr. Larry Howard confirmed the body belonged to a female between the ages of 19 and 40 years old who had been about 5'1", of medium build with brown hair, dentures, a history of pregnancy, a missing appendix, and she was wearing a blue dress. As it turned out, Delia Parker Young had undergone an operation to have her appendix removed. She wore dentures, and she'd been wearing a blue dress on the night she had gone missing. She borrowed it from Susie that night. However, when the body was found, it had been in the water for 18 months. The remains were in an advanced state of decomposition. The face was obviously unrecognizable, the skin and soft tissue largely gone, and like I said, both hands missing. So without fingerprints, without facial features, without some sort of identification, they weren't able to positively ID this body as Delia. Henry Ward, the coroner at the time, said, quote, "We never got anything concrete, no overwhelming evidence. We could never say without a shadow of a doubt that the body was Delia Parker Young. Only a conclusive identification of the automobile would make me feel comfortable saying Delia and Susie were the occupants," end quote. And so they sent divers back in, right? Because now a body's come up and it's suspected to be Delia. So they go in and they start searching, right? They want to find Susie. They want to find the car. But even though divers went in and even though they searched, they did not find Susie Roberts' Ford sedan. And since both women were technically missing, the authorities couldn't be sure if the body belonged to Susie or to Delia or to someone else entirely. The remains of the body found in Lake Lanier were buried in Alta Vista Cemetery in Gainesville under a simple anonymous marker that read something along the lines of "Unidentified woman found in Lake Lanier." Now, earlier I told you about the stories, right? Those first reports of a woman in a blue dress wandering near the bridge with no hands, appearing out of the fog and vanishing just as quickly. So when the lake finally gave up a body in 1959, a woman dressed in blue, her hands missing, it didn't quell the stories. It didn't stop them, right? And it didn't take long for the stories and the facts to merge. The image of that faceless, handless woman found floating near the bridge fused with the rumors that had already been spreading through the community, and together they gave birth to the legend that we still know today, the Lady of the Lake. For decades, sightings of the ghost continued. Drivers crossing the bridge reported seeing a woman in a blue party dress standing by the roadside. Some say she appeared to be waving screaming for help. Others saw her staring blankly as if dazed. Several stories say that a driver would stop to pick up the woman wearing this soaking wet blue party dress, and she would sometimes climb into their car, either silently or while weeping softly. However, if the driver turned to speak to her, she would vanish without a trace. The same thing would happen if the driver continued on. When they reached the end of the bridge, the woman in the blue dress would be gone. Swimmers in the lake have claimed to sometimes feel cold hands tugging at their ankles in the area near the bridge, as if something is trying to pull them down. And fishermen tell stories of seeing a pale face beneath the surface of the water, drifting just below their boats before dissolving into nothing. Over the decades, Lake Lanier's waters rose and fell with droughts and floods, and sometimes things would surface, but never Susie Roberts, never an old 1950s Ford. The Dawsonville Highway Bridge had since been repaired and expanded, the traffic moving constantly above the same dark stretch of highway where Susie and Delia had last been seen. It would be 31 years before Susie Roberts and her car would be found. In November of 1990, construction crews began work to widen the bridge over the lake, and as part of this job, divers were sent down to survey the lake bed and clear away obstacles, and there was many obstacles. So at a depth of roughly 90 feet, half buried in thick mud and silt, the divers saw the unmistakable curve of metal. They had spotted the roof of a car upside down, perfectly preserved in the cold water. When the mud was cleared away, the outline of a 1952 Ford sedan was revealed, rusted, but still intact. Inside, the skeletalized remains of Susie Roberts were found, still seated in the driver's seat. When the car was raised from the water and examined, investigators immediately connected it to the long-standing missing persons cases of the two Gainesville women. The body in the driver's seat was wearing clothing and jewelry that matched Susie's last known attire. And as it turned out, the car was discovered on the right side of the bridge, not the left, where divers and police had been searching. It was theorized that for some reason, which we still do not know, which we will never know, Susie lost control of the car and it plunged into the lake. Investigators had followed the direction of the skid marks in order to narrow down their search to the left side of the bridge. But many factors could have contributed to the vehicle not being where it should have been. When the Ford sedan went off the bridge, it likely entered the water at a high speed and at an angle. The lake was still relatively new, and the underwater terrain was very uneven, full of soft clay, silt, and submerged trees. If the car hit the water nose first, the current could have carried or rolled it several dozen yards from the entry point before it sank. And depending on the time of the year and the water flow from the Chattahoochee River, undercurrents could have pushed the car laterally, which would have ended it up on the opposite side from where the trajectory seemed to point. So while investigators assumed the car had gone straight down beneath the left guardrail, it may have actually arced underwater and settled far to the right. Another question that is often asked is, why did Delia's body surface 18 months after the accident, but Susie's never did? There's a few theories. I mean, Susie was the driver, and since she would have been behind the wheel when the car hit the water, she may have been pinned between the steering wheel and her seat, depending on how far up she was pushed. We know that she wasn't buckled in because seat belts didn't come standard in Ford vehicles in 1952, and airbags were not produced in cars until the 1970s. So, like I said, she could have just been slammed against the steering wheel, maybe pinned, maybe knocked unconscious by the impact. Delia, her passenger, she could have been thrown against the windshield or the door. She could have been ejected from the vehicle when it hit the water, or maybe as the car sank, she was still conscious and aware. And it's possible she managed to get a door open or even get a window open. And I mean, maybe the window was already open and they had the windows open while they were driving. And so she tried to escape, but she was unable to make it to the surface before drowning. Delia didn't rise right away. The water was cold, the depths colder still. When she was found, she was missing her hands and some toes, likely from decomposition, but also from aquatic life or snag and debris at the bottom of the lake. Down there, the lake is quiet, it's dark and starved of air, and this slows decay. Soft flesh turns to something like wax. Maybe she was tangled in the drowned forest below. Seasons turned, storms rolled the water, and when the lake finally let go and the chemistry of death caught up, Delia rose from the dark. To be honest, this is all a mystery. How the two women ended up going off the road, why Delia surfaced but Susie never did, and why through so many years in searches no one ever found the car sitting right there at the bottom of the lake, not far from where it went off the road, right next to the bridge, just on the wrong side that people were looking. Throughout the many questions, though, one thing remains, and that's the sightings of the Lady of the Lake. They continue until this day. Susie's brother, Bill Parker, says that he always knew his sister and her friend had ended up in the lake. He always knew that the body recovered 18 months after their disappearance was probably Delia, and when the car was pulled out decades later, it was definitely his sister and her vehicle. Bill Parker stated, quote, "When I found out they had pulled the car from the lake, something passed over me, and I said to myself, that's it. All of the things I felt were true. All along I knew something mysterious had happened to them. I always had the feeling the lake took her. But when something like this happens, all kinds of things pass through your mind." End quote. The deaths of Susie Roberts and Delia Parker Young were only the beginning. In the years that followed, Lake Lanier's waters have claimed hundreds more, swimmers, boaters, fishermen, each one adding another line to the lake's dark and growing history.
Now, DNR says the victim slipped off a dock at the Holiday Marina. That's about 3 miles from here, also on the lake, and his body was found 17 feet underwater.
It was a deadly weekend on Lake Lanier as 2 people drowned. This comes as authorities are still working a third drowning just last week.
Search and rescue crews are battling challenging waters as they work to recover a drowning victim.
2 people have already drowned in Lake Lanier this July 4th weekend. Officials have identified the 19-year-old man whose body was found in Lake Lanier.
10 feet off this dock, the Hall County Sheriff says is where they found 66-year-old Brent Williams dead, a foot underwater in Lake Lanier.
There were at least 2 deadly accidents over the weekend on Lake Lanier. A third person is still missing this morning.
17-year-old Christopher Acosta Farias went under while swimming from a dock to the shore around 4 p.m. Friday afternoon.
Tonight, a family is left desperate for answers after their 27-year-old son's body was recovered from Lake Lanier.
Susie and Delia's story may have ended when their car was raised from the deep, but Lake Lanier's story never does. Every summer, the headlines return. Another drowning, another disappearance, another family waiting on the shore. The lake keeps taking, and no one can quite explain why. Maybe it's the debris below, or maybe it's the weight of everything that's been buried there. Towns, graves, memories, whole histories that were never at peace. But Lake Lanier isn't the only place where water holds its ghosts. Because 2,000 miles away, high in the Oregon Cascades, lies another lake, one not born from flood or progress, but from destruction, a lake formed by fire, myth, and the fall of a mountain. If Lake Lanier was born from man's ambition, then Crater Lake was born from the Earth's rage. Nearly 8,000 years ago, a mountain stood here, Mount Mazama, towering nearly 12,000 feet above the Oregon wilderness. And then, one violent day, the mountain tore itself apart. The sky went black, the ground opened, and fire rained from the heavens. When the eruption finally ended, the summit of the mountain was gone, collapsed into itself, leaving behind a massive, smoldering crater nearly 6 miles wide. And for centuries, that crater lay empty, a wound in the earth. But slowly, as the fires cooled and the rains came, the wound began to fill. Storm after storm, year after year, until the hollow became a mirror, a lake so deep, so blue, and so still that it reflects the sky perfectly. They call it Crater Lake, but the Klamath people have always known it by another name, Giwas, which means sacred place, a place where heaven and the underworld meet. They say this lake was formed not just by fire and rain, but by a battle between 2 powerful spirits, Leo, god of the underworld, and Skell, god of the sky. The eruption, the Klamath said, was their war, and when Skell defeated Leo, he sealed him beneath the water forever. Now, Crater Lake sits in the Cascade Range of southern Oregon, a wild, rugged landscape carved by glaciers and scarred by volcanoes. It lies entirely within Crater Lake National Park, about 60 miles north of the California border and 100 miles inland from the Pacific Ocean. The lake itself is a perfect circle. semicircle, roughly 6 miles across and ringed by 2,000-foot high cliffs of volcanic rock. At its center, it plunges to a depth of 1,949 feet, making it the deepest lake in the United States and one of the clearest and purest bodies of water on Earth. There are no rivers flowing in or out of Crater Lake, and the only water it receives comes from rain and snowmelt. The only way it loses water is through evaporation or seepage, which means Crater Lake is a closed system, a natural basin of isolation and purity. And as I mentioned, long before Crater Lake existed, there was a massive stratovolcano that rose 12,000 feet above sea level, and that was Mount Mazama, which was part of the same volcanic chain that includes Mount St. Helens, Mount Hood, and Mount Shasta, all created by the slow collision of tectonic plates beneath the Pacific Northwest. About 7,700 years ago, Mount Mazama did erupt with catastrophic force, one of the largest volcanic events in human history. The eruption ejected more than 12 cubic miles of ash and rock, sending plumes of smoke 30 miles into the sky, scattering ash over 8 U.S. states and 3 Canadian provinces. When the eruption was over, the magma chamber beneath it was empty, leaving the towering summit with nothing to hold it up, causing it to collapse inward, forming a massive depression known as a caldera. Modern science does confirm that Mount Mazama erupted around 5,677 BCE, but the Klamath peoples didn't need scientists to tell them that because they were there. Before the eruption, the land was lush and green, filled with rivers, forests, and wildlife, and there were already people living in the southern Oregon highlands. Archaeological evidence shows human life here going back nearly 12,000 years to the end of the last ice age. These were the Paleo-Indians, the first people to enter North America after crossing from Siberia into Alaska. They followed game trails through the volcanic uplands, settling near rivers and lakes rich with obsidian and other stone used for tools. Sites like Fort Rock Cave and Paisley Caves have yielded sandals woven from sagebrush, bone tools, and stone points dating between 9,000 and 13,000 years ago, some of the oldest artifacts on the continent. Even before the Paleo-Indians arrived, this land was already shaped by fire. The Cascade Mountain Range has been volcanically and seismically active for an astonishingly long time, tens of millions of years, and it is part of the larger Pacific Ring of Fire, a 25,000-mile belt of tectonic activity that encircles the Pacific Ocean. This region contains about 90% of the world's active volcanoes, including those on the ocean floor, and roughly 75 to 80% of all earthquakes on Earth occur along the Pacific Ring of Fire. In other words, the ground here has never been still. And the people who eventually lived there, well, they adapted. They learned to live with the ash, the tremors, and the eruptions. The volcanic soil was rich, perfect for growing food and supporting game. And over thousands of years, those early communities evolved into the ancestors of the Klamath and related tribes. By 4000 BCE, they had pit house villages, intricate tools, and wide-reaching trade networks. They called their homeland the Upper Klamath Basin, and their lives revolved around water, rivers, marshes, and lakes that provided food, travel, and spiritual meaning. When Mount Mazama erupted around 5,677 BCE, these people were already here. They lived along the Williamson and Sprague rivers. They saw the sky go dark. They felt the ground split beneath them. And their stories, passed down for thousands of years, describe fire pouring from the mountain and the earth trembling. And those stories match very, very well with what geologists later uncovered. Almost word for word. The eruption was so violent, it destroyed everything. Searing clouds of ash and gas raced down the slopes at hundreds of miles per hour. Forests vanished. Rivers were filled with ash. The air turned poisonous. Those who survived fled east and south, but eventually they came back. Archaeologists have found the proof. In places like Fort Rock Cave and Paisley Caves, layers of ash separate older hearths from newer ones. It shows that there was settlements there, and then the volcano erupted and there's all these layers of ash, but over the layers of ash, there's more pottery, more bones, more proof that people inhabited that area again. Those same sites were occupied within just a few generations. The survivors returned to a world that no longer looked the same. The towering peak of Mount Mazama was gone. In its place was a vast smoldering crater that would one day fill with water, Crater Lake. So to the people who witnessed it, that wasn't just a geological event, it was the death of a mountain, the death of a giant, a wound in the earth itself. And over time, the story became the myth, the battle of Lau and Skell, a war between the spirits of the underworld and the spirits of the sky. Now, the Klamath legend says that long before there was a lake, there was a mountain, Mount Mazama, tall, proud, and alive with fire. The people who lived beneath it said a great spirit dwelled inside, a god named Lau, ruler of the underworld. Far to the south, high above the clouds, lived Skell, god of the sky. He watched over the earth from his home atop Mount Shasta, and the people knew him as a protector. One day, Lau looked up from his dark realm and saw a mortal woman standing in the sunlight. She was beautiful, radiant, alive, everything the world beneath could never be. He rose from his fiery pit and came to her, promising riches and power if she would go with him. But she refused. Humiliated, Lau's rage shook the mountain. He tore open the earth, spewing fire and smoke into the sky, vowing to burn the world that had rejected him. Skell saw what was happening and descended from the heavens, determined to protect the people, and so began the Great War, the battle between fire and sky. The earth trembled beneath their fury. Rivers boiled, the forest burned. They hurled mountains at each other, their weapons made of molten stone and thunder. The sky turned black, and ash fell like snow. For days, the world was nothing but smoke and fire. In the end, Skell struck Lau down. He tore open the mountain and cast the god of the underworld back into his fiery pit, sealing him there forever. The mountain collapsed inward, its heart hollowed out, and Skell wept for the destruction that had been done. His tears filled the crater, cooling the earth, and from that sorrow was born Giwas, what we now call Crater Lake. The people say Lau is still down there, trapped beneath the water, watching from the shadows, and sometimes, when the wind dies and the surface lies perfectly still, they say you can feel him stir, the lake rippling like something alive beneath your feet. Now, it's important to understand that even though the Klamath people returned to the region after the eruption and resettled the surrounding valleys, they did not live near Crater Lake itself. Instead, the lake became a sacred and restricted place, visited only under specific spiritual circumstances and only to be used by shamans and vision seekers, not by the broader community. Remember that to these people, the eruption wasn't a natural disaster with a scientific explanation. It was the site of a cosmic battle between two powerful gods. When the mountain collapsed and filled with water, it became a seal over the underworld, a kind of supernatural prison. Because of that, the Klamath believed that Giwas was too spiritually powerful and too dangerous for ordinary people to approach. The rim of Crater Lake, or the high rocky edge surrounding the lake, that was considered forbidden ground and was treated with profound reverence. To these people, it wasn't just the edge of a lake, it was the edge of the world, the thin line where the realm of the living met the realm of the spirits. The lake itself was seen as sacred, and only shamans or those undergoing intense purification rituals could travel to its edge, usually for vision quests, fasting, or spiritual testing. In Klamath belief, shamans were the mediators between worlds, the only ones capable of safely contacting the spirits of Giwas. They would undertake long journeys and purification rituals before climbing to the rim. Some would fast for days, some would remain silent for weeks, and some would offer obsidian, bone carvings, or bits of food to the lake spirits. The Klamath believed that the visions received at Giwas could grant wisdom, healing, even supernatural power, but only if the seeker survived the experience. Many were said to return, changed, haunted by what they had seen. Some never returned at all. For everyone else, the normal people, Giwas was to be respected from afar. They did not bring their children there to play along its banks or to swim in its cooling waters. No, they told their children, don't even look into its waters. Never shout across its rim. That's very disrespectful. Never disturb its silence. One Klamath man said, quote, "The higher the peak, the better the vision. You had to work hard to get to those higher places, and a long climb was important to having a good vision. You had to clear your mind of anger, of any bad thoughts that would cloud your mind. You had to be clean to go there. People went there looking for direction or help. There were different kinds of doctors. There were spirit doctors and doctors for the body. Some of the most powerful doctors got their powers from Crater Lake. It is a sacred place. We have used it ever since the eruption. It wasn't a place that just anybody could go to. You had to be prepared. It was too powerful for ordinary people. We didn't fear the lake, as the white people suggested. We respected it." End quote. It was well known to the Klamath peoples that Crater Lake was not to be trifled with, and it could be dangerous. It was a doorway to the lower world, and so beings existed there that were far outside human understanding. Klamath children were taught that dark spirits or water beings lived in the depths, sometimes rising to the surface as flickering lights or glowing eyes. An elderly Klamath woman talked about her experience of seeing something on the lake in the 1940s, and she said, quote, "When I was young, I went up to Crater Lake with a woman I knew. She tied my eyes and led my horse. Then she said, 'Untie your eyes,' and I nearly fell off the horse. I saw a man standing on the water far away, just like in the Bible. He scared me. I don't know who that was." End quote. It was also known that the lake could claim people who were too loud near it, who were too disrespectful near it, even those who looked too long into its waters. And gazing upon the lake risked pulling your spirit downward. In several Klamath accounts, the floor of the lake contains a mythical world. Quote, "People were stolen and taken down into Crater Lake by beings there. Some say they have found no water in the lake. Instead, there were rocks as big as trees and deep tunnels in the bottom. There are animals, snakes, and a sort of people who live in the ocean." End quote. In oral stories, Lao is not the only being sealed below the lake because he rules over a host of lesser spirits, restless entities that inhabit the cold water. They were said to drag down those who disrespected the lake or spoke its true name too loudly. And then there is Wizard Island, right? Wizard Island is also another interesting feature of Crater Lake, and it is said to be Lao's watchtower. Rising like a silent sorcerer's hat in the middle of Crater Lake, Wizard Island is the only volcanic cone inside the caldera that's still visible above the water. It was born after the mountain's collapse, the ghost of fire rising from the deep, and as the lake filled, eruptions persisted, but most of the new cones sank beneath the waters. Wizard Island was rare because it found strength enough to break the surface, but even that is only a fragment of what lies below, because keep in mind, Crater Lake is hella deep. Some witnesses claim seeing smoke or mists rising from Wizard Island at night when no natural source like fire or chimneys exist. These are sometimes ascribed in local legends to spirits or to the residual heat or energies of the island. But there's also stories of dragon-like forms or shadows moving beneath the waters near the island. Creatures glimpsed in fleeting moments, vague shapes dark against the blue depths. One report in local storytelling mentions seeing, quote, dragon-like lake monsters lurking near Wizard Island. And Wizard Island is sometimes described as one of the most haunted spots in Crater Lake due to its isolation, its connection to the Klamath spiritual lore, and its visibility as the one landmass rising from the water. One of the most persistent legends involves campfires seen burning on Wizard Island, despite there being no campers, no smoke, no fire pits, and no signs of recent burning when rangers investigate. Ranger Jan Kerwin is cited in park lore as saying she once saw 10 people gathered around a roaring fire on the island, and when she and another ranger later went to inspect, the campsite had vanished. Not only were there no people there was no footprints, no ashes, nothing at all. Park logs and stories collected in the Smith Brothers Chronological History of Crater Lake include several such reports involving rangers responding to reports of glowing campfires or lighted areas on Wizard Island, only to find nothing when they arrive. So on that note, let's talk about the lights, which are one of the more eerie and persistent parts of Crater Lake's mystery, bridging the gap between Indigenous legend and modern reports. Long before Crater Lake Park existed, the Klamath people told stories of glowing eyes and firelights that appeared over the lake at night. They said these lights were the servants or messengers of Lao, and they were trying to escape. The lights would appear when the balance between the worlds was disturbed, when someone disrespected the lake, or when a shaman performed a ritual near the rim. The lights sometimes hovered over Wizard Island before shooting straight upward into the sky. Even in the late 19th century, explorers and settlers described what they called lanterns drifting in the air above the water, lights that would appear and then disappear silently. And even after the area became a national park, the stories never stopped. Park rangers and campers have reported strange orbs of bluish or white light moving silently above the water, sometimes rising and then vanishing straight down as if pulled back beneath the surface. To this day, visitors still report seeing what they call ghost lights, or the blue fires of Lao. Some witnesses describe them as soft glows, others as bright flashes that reflect in the water but have no source. And I guess there's all sorts of logical explanations for these lights because we know they happen. Too many people have seen them and consistently reported seeing the lights over Crater Lake to say that it's just, a coincidence or everyone's lying. People are seeing them. And yeah, there could be natural reasons for why that's happening. Some scientists say what people are seeing is ball lightning, which is a rare kind of plasma that forms when electrical energy meets volcanic gases. It is very rare. Others point to the rocks themselves, saying the caldera is rich in quartz, and when those crystals are put under pressure by the earth shifting below, which it always is, they can release bursts of electrical charge. A few researchers have even wondered if bioluminescent microorganisms could be responsible, though none have ever been found in these cold, pure waters. And then there is the most simple explanation of them all, which is refraction. The lake is so clear, so still, it can bend and distort light from miles away. Headlights, campfires, even starlight. And that might give some explanation to why people now are seeing those things, with all of the light pollution out there. There's tons of headlights and campfires and lights from homes, etc. But back in the times of the Klamath people, or back when the settlers and explorers were coming here, you wouldn't have really had all of that to create the amount of lights that people were seeing, even all the way back then. What we do know, though, is by the 1940s and 50s, right in the middle of America's UFO craze, so many people were reporting the same thing: lights over Crater Lake. Lights that would appear and disappear. Lights that would shoot straight up and then shoot straight back down into the water as if they were being pulled by an unseen force. And all sorts of people were reporting this. Pilots, park rangers, just regular people walking along. The sightings were so frequent at this time that a few local newspapers in Oregon started calling Crater Lake a hotspot for flying saucers. On February 4th, 1997, several witnesses reported 3 bright disc-shaped craft speeding across the night sky over the lake. Some claimed the discs disappeared into the water itself, giving rise to speculations of underwater UFO bases. In Oregon's Crater Lake Mysteries, one article notes that UFOs flit in and out of the water in the lake area. And there are several speculative theories about why Crater Lake might attract UFOs. Among some UFO and paranormal communities, there is a belief that there's hot spots in the world, cosmic portals or doorways, often tied to sacred or ancient places like ancient mounds, ley lines, craters, springs, etc. Crater Lake, as a sacred place with deep geology and deep spiritual significance, fits into that mold perfectly. Some believe that UFOs, or interdimensional entities, will use bodies of water or vertical shafts in the earth, like volcanic calderas, as entry or exit points. So a lake with dramatic depth that was created by a crater might be an invitation or a gateway. Additionally, volcanoes, tectonic faults, and deep crustal structures sometimes create magnetic anomalies or energy fields, and UFO lore frequently links strange lights to places of high geophysical energy. Because Crater Lake rests in a collapsed volcanic caldera and is among the deepest lakes in the US, folklore suggests there may be unusual subterranean energy, geothermal vents, or geological power grid conduits conduits beneath the water. In simpler terms, when people talk about magnetic anomalies or energy fields, they're really just describing the natural forces in the earth that can behave strangely in places like Crater Lake. Crater Lake does sit inside the collapsed top of a volcano, which means there's still a lot of heat, pressure, and moving rock deep beneath it. Those underground movements can sometimes cause small magnetic or electrical fluctuations in the area. Scientists call that a magnetic anomaly, but to the average person, it just means your compass might act funny or electronic readings might be off for no obvious reason. But like I said, some people believe those spots might be hot zones for strange activity, which means the lights could be UFOs or otherworldly things, or at least have otherworldly sources. And the lights aren't the only mysteries that Crater Lake holds. There's a long, unsettling history of disappearances and unexplained accidents in this region. Hikers vanish without a trace in the dense volcanic forests. Plane wreckage appears on slopes with no clear record of flight plans. Campers report waking to strange whispers or watching unseen shapes slip into the shadows. Let me give you a few examples. Early in the park's history, a photographer named B.B. Bukowski vanished while working in the Crater Lake area. Bukowski was well known for scenic images and postcards of the Oregon landscape, and he was well used to roughing it in the wild in order to capture these beautiful images. Yet, while on a winter photographic expedition to Crater Lake in February of 1911, he vanished. Searchers eventually found his camp and camera equipment fully intact, but no sign of his body and no answers as to what his fate had been. On October 14th, 2006, 8-year-old Sammy Bohelke went missing near the Cleetwood Cove area of Crater Lake Park. He was walking with his father, Kenneth, and according to Kenneth, Sammy had suddenly run ahead up a cinder slope into the woods, and then he vanished. Immediately after he disappeared, a massive search was launched with more than 200 people, and they scoured the area, but no trace of Sammy was ever found. And keep in mind, his father, Kenneth, is behind him on this path, and then he said Sammy ran ahead and then vanished, but his father, Kenneth, was right behind him. So he's going after him saying, Sammy, come back, Sammy, come back. And by the time he kind of caught up to where Sammy should have been, there was no Sammy. Historical records and park archives note that in 1945, multiple aviation incidents occurred in and around Crater Lake, including air crashes and mysterious smoke or dust clouds. A Grumman torpedo plane reportedly crashed into the lake during World War II, according to the Smith Historical Chronicle. The story, as told in some aviation community forums, goes like this. 2 torpedo bombers were flying near Mount Scott when one pilot, upon turning to look for the other, realized his wingman had disappeared. The missing plane was assumed to have plunged into Crater Lake, even though no confirmed wreckage recovery was ever documented. So basically, this bomber just vanished while they were flying over Crater Lake. Just vanished. No sign of it. They never got the wreckage. They never saw anything floating to the surface. Just completely vanished, like the Bermuda Triangle of Oregon. And then on September 23rd, 1995, a company-owned helicopter carrying 2 passengers was traveling to an aviation convention in Vegas when it crashed and sank almost 1,500 feet into the lake. Visitors on the rim watched the helicopter maneuver low over the caldera, circling Wizard Island. And with the lake glassy calm and the sun ahead, they said that the craft appeared to descend on a shallow path and fly into its own reflection, striking the water at a pretty high speed. The engine was heard producing power right up to impact, meaning nobody let off the gas as they approached the water. It seemed to fly into its own reflection. And because the helicopter was privately owned, the owners were legally expected to cover the recovery costs when the crash occurred on federal land. According to reporting, more than $100,000 was paid by the owners of the helicopter, American Eurocopter, and they gave that money to the National Park Service's recovery and survey operations, which included around 2,000 park officials and contractors conducting a detailed sonar imaging survey of the lake bottom near the crash site. They sent divers down there. The goal was to detect large pieces of the frame of the helicopter or to locate some sort of wreckage debris field. But the result was nothing. No identifiable debris. blade, not a seat frame, not a chunk from the fuselage, nothing. Park officials have publicly stated that the force of the crash likely obliterated much of the helicopter on impact, scattering parts across the basin, but not one part of the helicopter was found, even though people saw it like fly into its own reflection. So we know it's in there. That's kind of crazy. We should also talk about the two men who were found dead in the park in 1952. On July 19th, the bodies of Albert J. Jones and Charles P. Culhane, both executives with General Motors, they were discovered in Crater Lake National Park. The two men had been expected at a cabin in the area that weekend, presumably for a getaway or a meeting, but they never arrived. Their remains were found by a trail crew, and it was discovered that they had been murdered execution style. The case became one of the largest and longest unsolved federal homicide investigations in Oregon, even involving the FBI. And in recent years, a Portland photojournalist named Monty Orrick has claimed to have solved the murders. His theories rely in part on a deathbed confession made in 1966 by a Klamath County resident named Oscar Errol, who allegedly told his wife that the killers were Kenneth Moore and John Wesley Cole. Oscar claimed that Kenneth Moore had told him this in confidence and that it was a crime of opportunity that turned into a botched robbery. Orrick asserts that FBI records as well as unpublished case files support this confession, though officially no charges were ever brought. There have been multiple suicides as well, visitors who drove to the rim, parked their cars, and never came back. Rangers find notes left on the dashboard or backpacks abandoned near the cliffs. In 2016, a man leapt from the rim and was found days later floating near Wizard Island. Others have simply walked into the surrounding forests and disappeared, leaving behind no trace but tire tracks and questions. There are stories of campers who woke to find their tents unzipped, waking up to the sound of footsteps or whispers near the rim of Crater Lake at night. It's very creepy. If you look online, there's so many accounts of people saying, hey, we camped at Crater Lake National Park, we camped by the lake. This is a very creepy place to be at night. You know, the lights over the lake, the Wizard Island rising in the dark distance, whispers, our tents getting unzipped. We can hear people out there talking, but then we look out and there's no one there. A lot of these accounts, which I think means there's something to it. Let's leave the outside for a moment, though, and seek some warmth and shelter inside, because we've been walking around these lakes all day, and we need to just chill now. So, Crater Lake Lodge sits directly on the southern rim of Crater Lake, perched at an elevation of about 7,000 feet. The lodge was the brainchild of William Gladstone Steele, often called the father of Crater Lake National Park. He believed that the lake's beauty deserved an equally grand place for visitors to stay, a place that would draw people to the park and showcase Oregon's vast wilderness in luxury. However, the project for the lodge was plagued with problems from the start. Some might say it was cursed. Workers battled the elements and altitude to haul materials 18 miles uphill from Fort Klamath over primitive dirt roads that turned to mud in the spring and were frozen solid by autumn. Steele's dream was grand for sure, but the reality was that he never had enough money. Funding came mostly from private investors and small government allocations, which was not nearly enough for the grand design that he envisioned. The project officially began in 1915, but by the time the lodge opened in 1919, it was not good. It was not good. Parts of it were unfinished. Most of it was hastily built. At that point, some of the early investors pulled out, and they were like, is this what we paid for? You know, like what is this rugged hunter's cabin when you said you were building a luxury lodge? The early investors complained that the site was too isolated, construction costs were mounting because of the isolation. And so to keep work going, the builders cut corners a lot. Like, I think that maybe they actually physically cut some corners sometimes. It's a figure of speech, but I wouldn't be surprised if they just went in there with saws and started like sawing off corners of the rooms to make more room or to get more material. So the walls were only 1 stone thick Insulation was minimal, and the roof leaked from day one, which early guests were quick to point out and complain about, along with complaining about drafty rooms, even floors collapsing. You're just sitting there by a crackling fire, and then the floor caves in. Early reports describe the lodge as more rustic than elegant, and they focus on its shoddy workmanship. The foundation was unstable. I mean, where it was built, it's literally on a rocky ledge. The sections of this lodge were actually built on top of uneven volcanic rock. They didn't even it out or anything. The floors were always uneven. Some of the windows didn't fit their frames. Guest rooms were constantly cold because the windows didn't fit their frames. The plumbing often froze. And during heavy storms, rainwater would leak through the roof and make large puddles in the lobby. And I don't mean a little puddle that you can put, a pan underneath and it becomes part of your ambient noise. No, I mean the whole place was just flooded. And still it went on, and it took guests, and they tried to kind of keep it together with glue and thumbtacks. But in 1989, the lodge had fallen into serious disrepair, and it was condemned for safety reasons and for obvious reasons. A major $15 million restoration effort began soon after, and the lodge reopened in 1995, fully refurbished, but still echoing its original aesthetic with roaring fireplaces, timber beams, and panoramic windows overlooking the caldera. Although the lodge itself was polished up and brought to safety standards, there's just something about it that still feels otherworldly. Its heavy, rough-hewn look gives it an almost fortress-like quality, as if it's trying to withstand both the elements and the ancient energy of the lake below. When fog rolls in, which it often does, the building can look like it's floating on a cloud, adding to its surreal haunted hotel feel. The air is thin, the wind sharp, and the silence immense. At night, the lake vanishes into darkness, and the stars appear impossibly close. Guests describe an odd sense of isolation, as if the rest of the world has fallen away, and many guests also report seeing things at the Crater Lake Lodge that just shouldn't be there. According to ghost tour websites, people have claimed to feel a menacing presence in the lodge, something that makes it hard to sleep, causes nightmares, or gives people a sense of being watched. Some say they've seen or sensed a little girl walking the hallways late at night. They hear childlike footsteps in the halls, specifically on the second and third floors, and catch fleeting glimpses of the child in doorways or at the end of hallways. Another commonly cited account is of a Chinese man in the elevators of the lodge, a spirit said to manifest briefly on certain floors or when the lift moves. He doesn't stick around long enough to tell anyone who he is or why he's there, but historically, there is a very real connection between Oregon's early infrastructure and Chinese immigrant labor. By the time Crater Lake Lodge was under construction, the wave of large-scale Chinese labor in Oregon had already reached its peak, but its legacy was everywhere. In the railroads, the mines, lumber camps, and even some of the roads that made access to the lodge possible. Chinese immigrants began arriving in Oregon in the 1850s, drawn by the gold rush, but quickly spreading into other industries. By the 1870s, Chinese workers made up a huge percentage of the labor force in certain parts of the Pacific Northwest, and they helped build some of the earliest Oregon rail lines. These workers were known for taking the most dangerous and grueling jobs, such as blasting and tunneling through volcanic rock to carve out rail beds and wagon roads, and cutting timber in the Klamath Basin that would later be used in regional construction. Even though no records show Chinese laborers working directly on Crater Lake Lodge, the region was literally built partially on the labor of Chinese immigrants, men who toiled in dangerous, forgotten jobs for very little pay, often dying in explosions, rock slides, or isolation. So it wouldn't surprise me if the spirit of one of these men remained behind, a ghostly reminder of those who paved the way. Admittedly, Crater Lake is one of the most beautiful places in the world, and one of the strangest. It was born from destruction, a mountain collapsing in on itself and filling with snowmelt and silence, or the tears of a god, based on what you want to believe. But even after thousands of years, it doesn't feel still. The air hums, the water glows, and the stories never stop. Gods trapped beneath the surface, lights that dance across the sky, hikers who vanish, and whispers in the halls of the lodge. The lake's unnatural stillness only heightened those beliefs. On calm days, its surface is so mirror smooth, it reflects the world with eerie perfection, like a portal to another realm. Maybe it's the magnetic pull of the caldera, maybe it's the human need to give shape to the unknown, or maybe this place really does remember. The Klamath said spirits were sealed in the lake long ago, punished for their pride. Scientists say the crater holds nothing but rainwater and time, but standing on that rim, looking down into water so blue it feels bottomless, it's hard not to sense both things could be true, that this lake is alive in some ancient way, still holding the memory of fire, of thunder, of war, of everything that came before. Crater Lake and Lake Lanier. They call them lakes, but that's just the map's word for them. Lanier is a reservoir poured over bones and broken deeds, a second burial for towns that never got a proper goodbye or a proper treatment. Crater Lake is a wound healed smooth, a blue eye staring up from where a mountain fell and a god was chained. One was engineered, the other unleashed, and both learned the same trick: how to hold a story without letting it go. At Lanier, the drowned roads still run straight into darkness. Graves that weren't moved listen for names no one says anymore. A woman in a blue dress keeps pace with their headlights and never makes it to the other side of the bridge. In Oregon, the rim is a threshold and the water is a witness. Lights rise and sink with no sound. Wizard Island keeps its watch, and the lodge dreams on foundations that had to be rebuilt because the mountain would not share its edge. We can explain parts of it: currents, cold shock, refraction, geology, a lot of drownings happening in a lake because of all the obstacles underneath the water, but explanation doesn't drain a place. It just teaches the water to keep its secrets quieter. And this kind of led me to looking a little bit further into water and the science of water. Now, scientists will tell you water has no memory, that its molecules are restless, bonding and breaking millions of times every second, rearranging themselves so often that anything they might remember is gone in the blink of an eye. Water, they say, forgets instantly. However, some say that water is alive in its own quiet way. It listens and it reacts. It remembers, maybe not with thoughts or images, but with energy, with vibration. In the late 1990s, a Japanese researcher named Masaru Emoto began to wonder if water could feel, if emotion and intentions could leave a mark. So he took samples of ordinary water and exposed those samples to different energies, different words, music, prayer, emotions like anger, right? So he whispered love and happiness and affirmations, positive affirmations to one vial, and he whispered hatred and insults to another. He played Mozart for one vial and heavy, discordant music for the next. Then he froze the samples and looked at the ice through a microscope, and the results were very strange. The water that had heard kind words and soft music formed delicate, perfect crystals, tiny snowflakes of symmetry and grace. The water that had been screamed at or insulted, cursed at, it formed broken shapes, jagged and warped. Emoto believed this proved something extraordinary, that water could respond to intention, that emotion itself left an energetic fingerprint. Many scientists have dismissed his findings, calling them pseudoscience, but others looked at those photos of shattered ice and the way the different crystals developed, and they couldn't shake the feeling that he might have touched something bigger, that maybe water really does absorb what it's surrounded by. And if that's true, then what happens when water is surrounded by pain, by tragedy, by theft, by violence, aggression, loss? What happens to a lake built on the bones of a town, or the graves of the forgotten, on stories that were never told? Maybe that's why some places feel heavier than others. Maybe it's because the water there has listened for too long and has listened to too much, absorbing the grief, the rage, the echoes of every scream and silence that fell upon it. And maybe that's what we're feeling when we stand at Lake Lanier or stare into the endless blue of Crater Lake. It's simply full, saturated with centuries of human emotion and bad intentions, still vibrating with everything it's ever touched. Maybe when people say a place is cursed, in a way they're not wrong, because even if water forgets the details, it never truly forgets the feeling. So if you go to these lakes, go gently. Leave a word for the ones who were pushed out. Leave a coin for the ones who never came home. Don't shout across Giwas. Don't go into the waters of Lake Lanier. Stand at the shore and you'll feel it, that low hum, that tug just behind the ribs, the sense that something patient is taking inventory. Maybe it's physics, maybe it's memory, maybe it's the debt coming due. Either way, remember this: when the screen goes dark and the room gets still, not every haunting needs a house. Some haunt the water, and some are still learning your name. Thank you so much for being here with me for today's Harloween video. We have a few more Harloween videos left to go out through November. I'm very excited to bring them to you. I know this was a long one, so like it if you liked it. Share it if you think it's worth sharing. Subscribe if you haven't already. Let me know what you think about all of this in the comment section. And until next time, stay kind, stay beautiful, stay safe, and stay spooky. And I'll see you very, very soon. Bye.